Good morning again, everyone, and welcome back to today's launch of the Initiative on Religion, Pluralism, and American Public Life at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. There's sometimes when you meet an individual, never met them in person, you have one conversation and you felt that you've met the person your entire life. Our next speaker is that person for me. So when we saw each other today for the first time in person outside of Zoom, it was as if I've known her my entire life. Ayelet Cohen is the Pearl Resnick Dean of the Rabbinical School and Dean of the Division of Religious Leadership at Jewish Theological Seminary. Cohen assumed the position in 2022, becoming the first woman to hold this role since the founding of the Jewish Theological Seminary. A nationally recognized activist and writer, Rabbi Cohen is author of prayers and liturgy used by communities around the world. For more than a decade, she served as a rabbi at CBST, the world's largest LGBTQ synagogue, serving Jews of all sexual orientations and gender identities. She is the author of Changing Lives, Making History, CBST, The First 40 Years. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Cohen.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here with you, and an interesting exercise to try to focus on ideas and on God today. If the last presentation was about the God of philosophers versus the God of theologians, I guess this maybe is about the God of practitioners and those who struggled to believe, what we call them the Jews in the pews. So hope is hard to come by these days, especially for people of faith and communities of faith in this country who care about justice and who care about the other. We look around and there is so much to be scared of. There is so much work to do. There's so much that is broken. There is a staggering amount of injustice and disdain for humanity and disdain for difference. We're tired. We've been fighting certain fights for a long time. Despair is very seductive. Despair would be easy. Sometimes the fight for justice feels like we're trying to gather sand from the beach, and every time we get a handful, the grains keep falling through our fingers. So, Jews just finished this fall cycle of our high holidays, which begins every year with a long period of introspection and accounting for our souls. As we prepare for the Jewish New Year each fall, we're challenged to confront the ways in which we have fallen short in our lives, in our relationships, in our relationship with God, in our religious practice, with other people, with our Jewish community, with the environment, and with the world. It is simultaneously an extremely joyful and an extremely intense time if you do the work. The sacred texts of that season guide us through two parallel tracks of work we need to do. That internal accounting, the soul work, and an audit of how we show up in the world. The first of our weekly Torah readings in the month of Elul, the month leading up to the Days of Awe, contains the famous verse from Deuteronomy, "Justice, justice, you shall pursue." Acknowledging in that moment that we will need extra strength to fulfill that mandate. That repetition, justice, justice, in Hebrew tzedek, tzedek, in that portion. Abraham Joshua Heschel explained that the repetition is there because more than just fulfilling justice, as we might do with other commandments, here we must actively seek out justice to pursue it. It's about both the means and the goals. It's about pursuing justice justly, in just ways. The medieval Bible commentator, Abraham ibn Ezra, talked about that same repetition. Why would Moses have to repeat the word tzedek, justice, twice? To indicate that we need to pursue justice whether we gain or whether we lose from that pursuit. He also imagines that the word might be repeated to indicate that we must continue to pursue justice as long as we exist throughout our lives. And of course, as we know, it's repeated for emphasis. So why all of this repetition, and why that timing of justice, justice you shall pursue, just when we are beginning that work to begin for the high holy days? Because we have to ask ourselves, at that moment and at many moments, are we doing everything in our power to pursue justice? Is there a way that I could use my voice, my position, my skills, my abilities that I am not yet activated in my pursuit of justice? What's getting in my way? Is it fear? Is it exhaustion? Is it not knowing what the next step is to take? The scope of injustice in the world can feel overwhelming, and the need for the pursuit of justice so tremendous that we can feel daunted and overwhelmed into inaction. We can't know for sure that our pursuit of justice will be fruitful. We don't know if the little we can do will actually make the change. So starting that new year for the Jewish people, or starting any new chapter for any of us, starting a new chapter in difficult times is an intense exercise in faith. It's one that we feel frequently, that tension, but we can try to avoid it, except when the season demands it, right? When the season demands some kind of optimism and excitement and new beginnings, how can we wonder? How can we wonder how to start new? Will anything really be different? And when the season is full of more fear than joy, of course we ask that question, how do we move forward? For us, for our high holidays, the rituals call upon us to dress and to decorate our sanctuaries in white, like a new page that has just been turned, and we pray for a new beginning. But the liturgy of the season is not about false optimism. It's not about empty promises. It demands that we give voice to the grief and the loss of the previous year while making room for hope. That's the work. Hope is a spiritual exercise. It is a radical act of faith. It is an indispensable ingredient for action. It invites us to open ourselves to the joy that would come if we were able to rally around those most vulnerable around us and acknowledge and heal the vulnerable parts within us. If we fulfill our part of that covenant, not to despair and to work towards justice, we might find God there. I'm often asked, is democracy of Jewish value? Now, we all know that people can quote scripture to make it mean pretty much whatever they want it to mean, and I wish I could say there is a clear commandment for democracy, but there is no question in my mind that the intertwining of moral and legal protection of the vulnerable in foundational religious Jewish texts, in the Bible and in later rabbinic work, the construction of the Talmud as a record of both minority and majority opinions, suggests that Judaism is, at the very least, compatible, if not predisposed, to a democratic system and a commitment to equality. Now, for many of us, but for Jews in this country, these are scary and confusing times. On the one hand, we have achieved tremendous freedom, tremendous privilege. We worship freely in this country in tremendous diversity. Many of us have worked to build relationships with other faith leaders and faith communities across deep differences in ideology, despite the legacy of Christian supremacy. We have built alliances to come together for justice work, to build our communities, to get to the core of the values that animate us so that we can do holy work together, work on immigration, on justice for LGBT people, on reproductive justice. We draw on our religious values. And many of our communities also have started finally to do the hard work of examining the ways in which we as Jews benefit from the hard-won privilege and power we fought to achieve as immigrants and religious minorities in this Christian country, and how we were complicit and benefited from racism as we achieved our security and tried to forget that our position here is fragile. But someone will always remind us that we are guests here in this Christian country. Christian supersessionist theology has long had extreme political consequences for Jews, from the Crusades to the Inquisition, to modern European anti-Semitism, to American white supremacy. We have seen attempts to mythologize, demonize, forcibly convert, and physically destroy Jews. Jews are to be tolerated at best, discarded when inconvenient, and frequently a helpful scapegoat. There, of course, are so few surviving witnesses to the horrors of the Holocaust and constantly new efforts to deny and erase it. Contemporary anti-Semitism is often much more polite, preferring erasure to annihilation. But ultimately, only the good Jews are welcome. There's room for the Jews who play the game, who don't ask for too much, who don't look for too different, who are willing to distance themselves from unpopular ideologies, even if it means compromising fundamental tenets of faith and community. The separation of church and state should mean that everyone in the American system is equal in the eyes of citizens, as we are in the eyes of God. But we know it's not always that simple. In particularly difficult times, there's a text from the Talmud that I really lean on. It comes from the Talmud in Baba Batra. It's about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the destruction of the Second Temple, which was a profound tragedy of epic proportions. It was a loss of a religious center, a cultural center, a way of life that resulted in exile, in alienation, and a need to really recreate what Judaism was. The sages taught, when the Second Temple was destroyed, ascetics increased among Israel, refraining from eating meat and drinking wine. Rabbi Yehoshua asked them, "My children, why do you not eat meat or drink wine?" And they answered, "How could we eat meat? Because offerings of meat were sacrificed on the altar in the temple. How can we drink wine, which was poured as libations on the altar? How can we eat and drink when those things have now ceased?" So Rabbi Yehoshua said to them, "Well, if so, we should not eat bread either, since meal offerings at the temple have ceased." And they said, "Okay, we can live on fruit." And he said, "Well, we should not eat fruit, because the bringing of the first fruits to the temple has also ceased." And they said, "Okay, we'll eat other fruits." And he said, "Well, if so, we should not drink water, because the water libation has also ceased." And they were silent. It's not uncommon to react to extreme trauma or loss with extreme behavior. Some turn their reactions outward and others inward. The rise in asceticism described in this text arose from despair and guilt about enjoying anything that had been associated with the temple. Of course, as Rabbi Yehoshua points out, this is not sustainable. We could not survive if we denied ourselves all enjoyment in the face of loss. We cannot live governed by fear, despair, and anger. Nor can we function as a community if we deny that anything has happened. The text continues. Rabbi Yehoshua says to them, "My children, come and I will tell you. Not to mourn at all is impossible, because the decree has been carried out. This thing has happened. We have suffered tremendous loss. But to mourn excessively is also impossible, because we do not issue a decree on the community unless the majority of the community is able to abide by it. We don't impose such strictures that it would make it impossible for most people to live, to survive. Therefore, the sages said, one may plaster their house, but leave a small part of it unplastered. One may prepare all they need for a meal, but leave out one small item. A woman may adorn herself, but leaves off one small accessory. To live as a Jew in this world is to move forward with our eyes open to the suffering, the injustice, and the loss in our midst all the time. There are days where it feels impossible to do anything other than mourn. And sometimes we need those days, and we need to give ourselves those days and let ourselves feel that grief, and then get up and return to life and return to the struggle for healing, justice, and peace. We subsist in a time of tremendous heaviness and tremendous loss, and a lot of us are in a constant state of dread and anticipatory loss on top of what we've already lost. If we don't allow ourselves to experience that, we'll never be able to experience joy. But too much mourning leads to withering away. We need to mourn. We need to channel our anger into something productive, not destructive. And we need to paint our homes and prepare our meals and adorn ourselves so that we can sustain ourselves for all of the necessary action to move us forward through excruciating times. That's the work. This passage concludes, anyone who mourns for the destruction of Jerusalem will merit and see joy. As it is said, rejoice with Jerusalem, in Isaiah, rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad with her. All that love her, rejoice for her, and all that mourn for her. There's no perfection in these broken times. There's always going to be a corner that is left unpainted. There is always going to be something that doesn't taste right. We know that we're not going for perfection. It's not available to us. And it's wiser to be aware that it's best not to try. It's best to be aware that we've got to leave room for what is broken. And we pray that our grief and our anger for all of the tremendous loss of these times will be channeled into real change. This year, on the high holidays, there was a heaviness that I'm not sure I remember from previous years, even other hard years. You know, so much of the traditions of the holiday are about sweet foods. Everything is cooked with honey. There's honey on the table. There's honey and apples. There's honey. And it was like nothing could sweeten the bitterness of this time. All of the honey in the world could not soothe the sting of this time. It felt hard to internalize and convey all of the anticipatory excitement of the new beginnings when it was supposed to be a time of celebration. And this was a combination of knowing we were coming up on the anniversary of October 7th, a year of tremendous loss and destruction for Israelis and Palestinian life. We were coming up on the election. It felt like instead of songs of joy, what kept coming to my head were the words of Psalm 137. How can we sing God's song in unfamiliar soil? It didn't feel like a joyous holiday in the midst of the horrible hurricanes, in the midst of the anxieties of the election, knowing that global warming is here, that there's so much division. Not to mention everything we've got going on personally. And also, in every year, with all of the loss, there are also beautiful things that happen. That is true too. Dr. Malila Helner Eshed, a professor of Zohar and Jewish mysticism at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, wrote about her feeling that the Shekhinah, the feminine indwelling presence of God, has been so absent in this past year. She explained, in the Zohar, we read so much about the state of the Shekhinah, which is thrust to the ground. She's lying in the mud. It means she cannot be present in the world in her full power and her beauty. She's dimmed. She's exiled. She was talking about how since October 7th, even in the peace camp, the Shekhinah is like a bird who is lying bleeding on the ground, and we have to tend to her. We have to tend to her, to nurse her back to life. We have to do that so she will stay in our midst. The greatest spiritual exercise, she wrote at the moment, and I resonate, is learning how to walk in the dark and sit in the dark, to read the signs in the dark, waiting for the light, but knowing it might be a very, very long time before it comes. And we can't just lay down and die. We have to learn how to live in the current state of reality. And that's my hope. That's one of my own core spiritual practices. It's a lesson I need and constantly return to. To pray that despite the horrors and the fears of this time, we can tend to that Shekhinah, that divine indwelling, that presence, and invite her to dwell among us, within us. If we open ourselves to that spiritual work and the activism that can stem from it, we can unlock tremendous joy, however significant the challenges. We can maybe evoke another psalm, Psalm 126, those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. Now, times of great challenge are also an opportunity to explore the spiritual practice of bitachon, of trust. How do we trust ourselves? How do we trust God? How do we trust each other? How do we build community in which we can ask for help, admit our fears? For 50 days in the Jewish calendar, we recite every day Psalm 27, from the beginning of that month of Elul before the high holidays, and all the way through the end of our high holiday cycle. For 50 days, every day, we recite all the words of Psalm 27, a daily touch point to check in with ourselves about our level of fear, our connection to God, and the internal work we hope to do. Despair, the idea that nothing we do will make a difference, that is a strategy of autocrats. Fighting that, and it is a fight, is the work of being in relationship with God. In Psalm 27, we read, God is my light and my help, whom shall I fear? God is the stronghold of my life, whom shall I fear? When evil people assail me and devour my flesh, it is they, my enemies, and those who besiege me, who will stumble and fall. Should an armed camp be arrayed against me, my heart would show no fear. The whole psalm is a play between those feelings of fear that bubble up and the feelings of faith that we try to connect to. One thing I ask of God, this I seek to dwell in the house of God all the days of my life. We're allowed to cry out. We're allowed to feel that despair. Hear my voice as I cry out. Be gracious and answer me. We feel that fear. What if no one hears me? What if no one comes to help? If only I could trust, the psalm ends, that God's goodness. Place your hope in God. Be strong and take courage and place your hope in God. We just read the story of the deluge of Noah's Ark. That was our Torah reading last week in the Jewish cycle. And it felt very apt. And I don't know if I'm ready to turn the page to the new portion, but it was last week, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. So we read, of course, about the ark as a temporary vessel intended to shelter living creatures in peace until they are ready to emerge into life renewed. And God instructs Noah to build an opening in the ark. The word in Hebrew is tzohar. It's a word that exists only once in the whole Torah. And the commentators wonder, if it's a window, say it's a window. Why use this word? Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, the Hasidic master who struggled with depression himself, and his texts are masterful in terms of exploring how to find joy as we struggle with despair. The difference between a window and this tzohar, which maybe is a precious jewel, is a window has no light of its own. It's simply a medium for light to enter through. But when there is no light, the window doesn't give light. With this tzohar, with this precious jewel, even when there is no outside light, the jewel shines of itself. The typical window would not radiate much light in these conditions, but Sohar radiates light from within. And he continues, Rabbi Nachman, so too there are people whose words are like a window, incapable of giving them light of their own. But there are those whose words can radiate light like a precious jewel. So that's what we try to do, is to be that light, to fight the despair, to internalize the hope, not because we are ignoring it, but because we are seeing it and doing the work. I want to finish with some words by the great poet Adrienne Rich. What would it mean to live in a city whose people were changing each other's despair into hope? You yourself must change it. What would it feel like to know your country was changing? You yourself must change it. Though your life felt arduous, new, unmapped, and strange, what would it mean to stand on the first page of The Edge of Despair?
Thank you so much. That was beautiful, and that was needed, and that was necessary. And the one thing that this style of thinking that we're attempting to practice together does not have those dichotomies between the theologian or the academician and the practitioner. And today you really provided us with an excellent bridge, understanding with Janet the depth of religious language, the very sociality of language, and the way in which it comes alive in community, and also the ways in which scripture, prayer, practice, language inhabits these spaces, and we cannot extricate language outside of it, and gives them new meanings. I want you to talk a bit about this idea of religious freedom that you raise. It's one of the founding freedoms in our Constitution, First Amendment, but yet we see religion being mobilized in this moment in a deeply political way, particularly in our democratic society. What does it mean to lean on religious freedom in a moment when religion animates so much of the antagonisms of our democratic society and the polarization that plagues American democracy?
You know, so you talked about words and the importance of thinking about these words, and so often the whole vocabulary of religion is monopolized in this country to mean a set of values that's anti-freedom, that's anti-protection. And we don't need to accept that. It's so important as religious practitioners, and whether that's clergy or lay people or academics or anyone for whom religious language is their language, that we don't have to give up that language. We don't have to cede it to those who would try to monopolize it and make it something ugly and dangerous. We can use it too. It belongs to us. And we can talk about the ways in which religion can be about liberation. It can be about love and equality and a sense of responsibility. And it's important that we keep using that language and don't give it up, don't give it away.
When you talk about using that language and not giving it up, and also enabling that language to be a language of conversation, I'm reminded of a wonderful moment in the history of JTS when Rabbi Herschel invited Martin Luther King in 1967 to address the rabbinical assembly up in the Catskills. This is 10 days before King was assassinated. This was a conversation, and I would encourage everyone to go to JTS's website. They've wonderfully digitized the transcript of this conversation. and we're so thankful for that. This was a hard conversation. There were real critical questions being raised. Here is the conversation between a Christian theologian operating a freedom struggle in the U.S. And the Rabbinical Assembly wondering what is its place in this struggle, in this nation, and how do we begin to adjudicate some of the competing strands. Questions around Black power comes up. But they forged a language to begin to talk. But they didn't avoid the conflict. And this is what Janet talked about as well. How do we begin to forge that language even through conflict? How do we begin to talk with one another?
So if we really look each other in the face and see the face of God in one another, then we're starting from a place of trying to listen, trying to recognize the holiness in one another, and then we can have real conversations. If we're not coming into it from a place of scarcity and a place of fear, that's what shuts us down. And it's hard because we're talking about hard things. We're talking about real deep disagreements. We're talking about real injury. And sometimes we need to look at ourselves and think about, what do I need to learn? What do I need to do differently? How do I need to apologize and take responsibility? We can only really do that if we can look ourselves in the face and if we can look one another in the face and imagine that the other person is also coming from a place of integrity, is coming from a place of pain, is coming from a place of concern, and even if what they're saying comes out in a way that is damaging to us, how do we develop that strength to say that and to inquire and to approach each other with curiosity so we can understand what it is that's driving each other for our quest for justice, for the things that keep us up at night. And some of them we're going to share and some of them we're not going to share. But if we believe in each other, that we're in this work from a place of trying to do right for other people, and we believe in the basic humanity of every person on earth, and are not trying to erase the humanity of people who are not like us, that's how we start.
You begin by invoking justice, and also in this moment. This moment is a trying moment globally. We have over 100 conflicts going on in the world. We've put the atmosphere on fire. We're at the precipice of nuclear war, the closest we've ever been in the history of humankind. We know what living in a post-atomic age looks like. What does justice look like in the face of the other when we can no longer see and maybe we need to hear?
Look, I think we're never going to be able to see all the way to the end. When you're walking towards the horizon, it keeps getting further away. So we have to take those steps not being sure if we are going to get there in our lifetime, right? So we just finished the reading of the Torah and started it again. And this holiday where we celebrate the completion of the Torah and starting the Torah also has this sad valence, because it's also the moment of Moses not being able to enter into the promised land. And somehow at the same time, it's a day of mourning and a day of tremendous celebration. So we don't know if we're the ones who are going to get there, but it doesn't mean that we can afford to stop going. Despair is a luxury of people who don't have enough skin in the game, who it's okay if it all blows up. It's not okay if it all blows up. You know, you and I both have ninth graders. We have a lot of work to do for them, to help them navigate these waters, to figure out how to do our piece of it. My rabbinic mentor, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, always says, you know, nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something.
Well, folks, I know I can continue on, but I want to also open up the opportunity, if you have any questions you'd like to ask of Rabbi Cohen. We still have a few more moments, we have about 10 more minutes. Alton Pollard.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was a delight. Oh,
We're gonna get the microphone for our
okay.
colleagues.
Sorry about that. Alton Pollard. Thank you again for your presentation. It was a delight to hear. It was a much needed word for the moment. My question goes back to one of the comments you made. Actually, you said it a couple of times about Christian supremacy. Is there a distinction, or are they synonymous, Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism? And what would you say or posit are the tenets of the saying? Is this something that crosses religious traditions writ large, or are there peculiarities to Christian supremacy?
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. I'm going to try, and then you'll tell me if I'm on the right track. I think, look, obviously, we are now in a reality where, so many Christians are able to understand the world in a very different way and are not in it because they are trying to convert everybody, replace everybody, disqualify other faith traditions. And yet that history is so powerful. So we need to simultaneously know that many, many people do not approach their faith with any of that intention and with any of that conscious awareness. And yet so much of this world is on a backdrop of centuries of, I mentioned the Crusades, I mentioned the Inquisition, terrible history of both trying to destroy others and convert others and deny the validity of other faith paths. So most Christians today aren't asking for that, don't want to do that, and yet our society is so colored by that history, sometimes we don't even notice it. The ways in which kind of casual Christianity infuses every single thing in this country, and we talk about separation of religion and state, but it's all on a backdrop where the default is that and everything else is other.
So that is I think precisely what I was wanting to hear. I would also, push a little further and ask, the layers of the onion, the valences of power.
Mm-hmm.
Some is very benign in intent. Some is unintended, unconsciously. But there are also those dimensions, aspects that are very intentional in their brutality, in their heinousness. That's also a part and parcel of, I think, both nationalistic and supremacist purview. So just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's really true. We see that not only in this country, but in so many places in the world right now. We're seeing, of course, this global democratic recession and so many empowered anti-democratic forces. And often that kind of autocracy is hand in hand with nationalism and supremacism in ways that are very scary.
Thank you.
I want to bring up one more. I want to bring up as we move the mic, casual Christianity. The ways in which casual Christianity aligns our political vocabulary, even our religious imagination. How does that casual Christianity challenge and frustrate some of those opportunities to have to be a border thinker, border conversations around Jewish and Christian thought? How do we begin to think through that casualness, make it much more explicit in our conversation?
One thing that is on my mind right now, just because we just left the season of our holidays, is an awareness of what the religious calendar is for everybody else who's not you. Being mindful during Ramadan that observant Muslims in your midst are fasting, and that's going to affect their experience of every single day and everything that's happening. I can't tell you how many of my rabbinic colleagues were invited to interfaith gatherings on Jewish holidays this year because people don't know about that one. You know about Rosh Hashanah maybe, you know about Yom Kippur probably. But then there's, a whole other week of other festivals, and a lot of us, are in synagogue continuing to do things. We're not in our offices, we're not on our desks, and yet we're invited to go to an interfaith council meeting on blah, 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 on a day that I can't get into, transportation. I'm in the middle of worship. And so some of it is that. It's just kind of taking that pause to wonder and do a little research ourselves. It's all out there, it's all available to think, what is this day for somebody else? In New York City, we have alternate side of the street parking, and it's suspended on any day that's a holy day for anybody else. And so it's actually an amazing primer for what day is a religious day of significance for anybody else, because if I don't have to move my car, it means it's a holy day for somebody. And then I can, do a little work on Google or something deeper and understand that this is a day of significance for somebody. And even though for me it just means I don't have to move my car. So we can do a little work to understand.
We have one question with Catherine Shaner, our New Testament professor. I want to also highlight Annalise, who's director of our program in Jewish Studies and professor of religious studies here as well. So we may come back to you after Kat.
Oh, Annalise, did you have a question?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So one of the things that you said, first of all, thank you. Thank you for this. But one of the things that you said toward the end was despair is a tool of autocrats. But then you also just said the idea that despair is a privilege, right? And so we need to move beyond despair in particular. But I'm really curious about that word autocrat because theologically, so often Christians, and I'm going to speak for Christians, Christians portray God as an autocrat. And so how do we move theologically away from that idea? I mean, I know how to do that in Christian circles, but I'm really curious about the interaction of God and autocracy. And how do we start to, because I do think that very deeply, and this is what your presentation brings up, very deeply, our theological premises are precisely what we operate out of, whether we know it or not. And so if God is an autocrat in Christian worlds, we're operating out of that assumption. We're operating out of the assumption that we're living in an autocracy. And I'm curious what your tradition has in terms of those theological tools.
That's so interesting. And I'm thinking a lot about the previous presentation in terms of thinking about multiple names for God. In Jewish liturgy, that's very, very much true, that there are multiple metaphors and multiple names for God. High holiday liturgy focuses a lot on the brand. And that is, it's an interesting challenge, because for so many Jews who only go to synagogue on the high holidays and only interact with prayer and liturgy on those days, the liturgy they get is so big, it's so long, it's so grand, and it's so presenting God in magisterial, sovereign, king, father, very gendered, very powerful, and for many, many people, very alienating and not accessible. Elsewhere in the liturgy, we see so many other metaphors of God as source of life, as source of strength, as healer of the brokenhearted, things that are, first of all, less about a power differential, and more welcoming to different orientations. If if someone happens to have a very broken relationship with their own parent, do they want to relate to God as parent? Is that a comforting metaphor, or is that an alienating metaphor? Having a lot of options to choose from. And in Judaism, we think about the way that we interact with translation of sacred text, because the ways that you choose to translate literature and scripture are so powerful in terms of what you're trying to convey and how you're gendering God and how you're describing God. So it's very powerful. I do think our prayer books are a statement of community values. And so the way we choose to emphasize certain topics, the way that we use to translate certain words say a lot about what we're trying to convey and whether we want things to be hierarchical or not. And also, how do we embody the contradictions? There's something that's very true in the in the high holidays. It's all about confronting life and death. We're not in charge of when we're going to die. We don't know when the last day we will live on earth will be. We can't control everything. We know, we keep learning that lesson again and again, try as we might. We are not in charge, and sometimes it's good to remember that we are a teeny tiny speck of nothing, and also that doesn't let us off the hook.
Emily?
Thank you so much for your talk and for your words. They were very powerful. And I want to highlight, you mentioned the good Jew in the US, and that as much as we try to think of Jews as not being, I understand that Jews are a marginalized people, and as a fellow Jew, I want maybe you to talk about this election and thinking about how maybe your words of wisdom for all of us, and thinking about how in the previous Trump presidency there were, I would say, white supremacists felt more comfortable operating in that white supremacist mode. And also, maybe you could speak particularly to LGBTQ plus and the focus of transgender issues, especially. I got a text from somebody in the Trump campaign thinking that I was going to support their awful exclusion of transgender people. My sibling is transgender, and I have a very close relationship with that. And so I'm wondering if you have words of wisdom for us. Thank you so much.
I don't have any wisdom. I have a lot of thoughts. Look, I think that what we saw in the last campaign and that administration, and again in this campaign, is a lot of the effort to divide and to sow fear and to play on the problematics of power. You know, you were asking before about power, and we need to acknowledge where power is. We need to acknowledge where privilege is. And when you have, whether it's an individual or a party or an ideology that's driven by a desire for absolute power at the expense of everything else, it's constantly changing the rules of the game. And if everyone is suddenly feeling, everyone who's marginalized in any way is suddenly feeling vulnerable, then what do? Do we grab onto whatever will help us feel stable and solid, even if we're pulling someone else down while we do it? Is it okay to benefit from something that makes me feel safe if at the same time it's making someone else feel less safe? These are the determinations we have to make every day in that kind of system. So every micro community was used as a weapon and targeted to in this election, certainly to try to sow fear. We know, a lot of lying, a lot of disinformation, a lot of manipulation of half-truths, and to play on the worst angels in everybody. We saw the way that happened with Israel and Palestine, and the way that the Jewish community was divided and, fighting with itself and trying to be monopolized by different factions. I have to admit, extremely relieved to see polling yesterday, and I tried not to look at polling, that I saw one number that 78% of the Jewish community voted for Harris, which is similar to what the numbers usually are. There was a lot of fear that number was going to go down because some of the lying and the manipulation of the campaign. When we're in a world that is normalizing racism and violence and oppression of other people, you start to, I think some people start to forget that that's unacceptable. And I think that's part of what we saw in this election. The way that the issue of transgender rights and transgender dignity was also used as a way to try to divide the LGBT community. Vance said something a couple of days ago about like normal gay men will vote for us. And it's about how do we figure out who can we peel off? Who is the most vulnerable that we can then try to peel off and turn other people against so that in their quest for their own safety, they will betray somebody else. I have 2 grown sons who live in Philadelphia and watch a lot of sports. And at every game that they watched, there were these anti-trans ads. I don't know if they were running down, they probably were running in North Carolina as well. We didn't get them in New York, but they were all over the Pennsylvania airwaves. Unbelievable anti-trans ads to sow fear. And why did they keep running them? Because they worked. They really worked. It touched something among certain voters, especially white men, and too many white women, and they bought it. And all of the fear mongering, all of the lying, coming from this place of profound scarcity and trying to tear down. It is so dangerous. We have to be so vigilant because it creeps in. We're kind of in this, bath of poison, and it seeps in.
Rabbi Cohen, thank you so much. Thank you.